Welcome to the Anglotopia podcast, where we explore the fascinating stories of British history, culture, and travel. I'm your host, Jonathan Thomas, and today we're joined by Robert Verkaik, award-winning journalist and author of The Traitor of Arnhem, the untold story of World War II's greatest betrayal and the moment that changed history forever. We'll be delving into the hidden espionage that shaped the fate of Operation Market Garden, uncovering the shocking role of double agents like Christian Lindemans and Anthony Blunt, and exploring how Soviet intelligence infiltrated the heart of the Allied war effort. We'll also discuss Robert's research journey, his personal connection to the story, and the newly released archives that reveal the full scale of this wartime betrayal. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you, Jonathan. Great to be on Anglotopia.
Excellent. We're glad to have you. So, what initially drew you to this story, and how did you first come across the hidden details of this betrayal?
Well, it's a family link, actually. That's what first drew me in. I've got a distant relative who was in Holland during the Second World War. In fact, he was a resistance fighter. His name was Eddie Verkaik, and he was just an ordinary guy, really. He worked for he was a shipping clerk, and he was it was a local chess champion. But when the Germans invaded, he joined the resistance, a small communist cell actually, and he did his very best to try and take the war to the Germans. He was in Eindhoven on the day of Market Garden, and so that's what drew me in to the whole Market Garden, and then from there I worked out the betrayal theory.
Fascinating. I wish I had a personal connection to World War II like that. Now, can you talk in the book a lot about Anthony Blunt, and can you give us some background for those who may not be familiar with who he was and how he was one of the biggest traitors in history?
Yeah, Anthony Blunt was one of the famous Cambridge Five, the sort of establishment, very privileged British graduates from Cambridge University who were recruited by Russian intelligence in the 1930s. Blunt's background was his connected to the royal family. Actually, his mother was cousin of the Queen's mother, and his father was a clergyman, but well-to-do clergy. And Blunt was extraordinarily clever. He was a genius, really. He was a natural mathematician. He was a natural linguist, and he won scholarships to Cambridge. He was also homosexual, and that sort of played a part in some of the recruitment that he was involved in, and some of his friends he made in Cambridge, like Guy Burgess, who was also recruited by the Russians. After the war, because during the war, Blunt was a senior officer with the Domestic Security Service, MI5. He had extraordinary influence and access to British war secrets. But after the war, he was rewarded for his work and was given the job of keeper of the King's pictures, surveyor of the King's pictures. And he went on. He was still working for the Russians even while he was doing that job in the 1950s. Really, he wasn't doing quite as much, but he was still keeping the other spies in contact with the Russian handlers, and he lived an exalted, privileged life in the palace, working with the Queen's pictures. He was a favourite of the Queen mother, but he wasn't actually exposed as a spy. His treachery wasn't known to the British public until 1979, when Margaret Thatcher outed him in the House of Commons. And after that, he was a spent force, and he died 4 years later, mostly through abuse of alcohol. But he lived a pretty charmed life for most of his time.
Fans of Anglotopia may recall that there's an episode of The Crown that covers sort of his downfall. So he was a real person.
He was indeed.
So now that we have sort of the people background, can you give us some background on Operation Market Garden, which is considered one of the biggest failures of the World War II Allied strategy?
Yeah, I think if we're talking about Market Garden, then we have to start really with D-Day, because that it was born out of the success of D-Day, and we also have to understand exactly what the military position was on the continent at the time. So we're talking about June 1944, after we'd landed on the beaches of Normandy, and the Russians. I bring the Russians into this because there's a real sort of geopolitical um, focus to the whole of the betrayal, and it's really Soviet driven. So we need to know what the Soviets were up to at the time of Normandy, and they were um, outside Warsaw, really, just waiting for the Germans to massacre the Poles, so they didn't have to do it themselves. But they were also, Stalin was very keen on um, winning the war in terms of his occupation of Eastern Europe. So he wanted an awful lot of Eastern Europe, and he thought that getting to Berlin and securing parts of Eastern Europe before the Western Allies, got there was his main goal, because the Germans were basically beaten. But time was of the essence. So when we landed in Normandy, we at first it looked like it was going to be a sort of replay of 1918. It looked like we were going to be, I was going to be bogged down in Normandy, because we took quite a long time getting out of the bocage. And once 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 we had, then everything changed, because once we'd broken out of Normandy and trapped the Germans in the Falaise pocket, and we were racing, certainly the British and Canadian forces were racing towards the Dutch border, the whole military battlefield landscape changed. And it meant that we were now in the driving seat. It looked like we were going to get to Berlin. We were advancing quicker than the Germans could retreat, and all it was going to take was one major operation, and that operation was Market Garden. And Market Garden was dreamt up by our most successful, the British most successful general, Bernard Montgomery. And his idea was that by landing 40,000 glider and paratroopers in occupied Holland and securing the key bridges over the Rhine, and then using his armored forces to drive over the bridges into the Ruhr, around the defensive Siegfried Line, and then on to Berlin, we would win the war before Christmas. I mean, the plan was extraordinarily appealing to Churchill, who understood, more than Roosevelt, understood the threat posed by the Soviets, because now it was clear that the Cold War had really started before the end of the Second World War. I mean, I think it started um, at Normandy, really, when it was when the race was on for Berlin, and the spoils of war were at stake, and the Russians wanted as much as they could possibly get. So Market Garden was going to be the way the British and Americans completed the war, defeated the Germans, and got to Berlin. But it was a daring, risky operation that ended in failure. And it ended in failure because, well, there were many reasons. I mean, there were the military reasons and there were intelligence reasons. And the military reasons were that the plan, as I said, was extraordinarily risky, but there were things that we did that perhaps in hindsight we wouldn't have done. For example, we landed 8 miles from the drop zone was 8 miles from Arnhem, which meant that by the time we landed and gathered our forces together and marched on Arnhem, the Germans were able to mount a fairly stiff resistance. The radios didn't work. We didn't have enough aeroplanes to drop everyone at the same time. the British and the American generals showed some caution when perhaps they needed to be a bit more aggressive in terms of taking the advantage. And the operation very nearly succeeded. The British First Airborne Division actually captured Arnhem Bridge, but the remainder of the force was held at just outside Nijmegen and never made it to complete the operation. So it was a finely balanced operation, nearly succeeded. Was always going to be risky, but there was another element to the operation which I'd say was critical, and that was that it was betrayed. The Germans had intelligence knowledge of the operation, and the two spies who gave them knowledge of Operation Market Garden. One was called Christian Lindemans, who was a Dutch resistance fighter, like my relative Eddie, who was working for the British, but was working for the Germans, but really working for the Russians. And someone called Agent Josephine, and I argue in the book that Josephine, who delivered the full battle plan to the German intelligence the day before Operation Market Garden, was in fact Anthony Blunt. That was him, and I try and prove that by saying that he was the only one who had the sort of means, the opportunity, and the wherewithal to deliver that sort of intelligence at that time. And he appears, when I was researching the betrayals, with these two betrayals, he kept featuring in the archives. It was always Blunt. Everywhere you looked, there was Blunt investigating Josephine, or the spy master is supposed to be running Josephine and covering up for Josephine, and generally trying to explain away Josephine. So that's the sort of thrust and thesis of the book.
So you argue in the book that Market Garden was doomed from the start. And in your research, what was some of the shocking revelations you uncovered that were just like, whoa?
I think the shocking stuff really is the cover up. I think because we hadn't, until you read the archives, no one was aware that there was a second betrayal. So everyone knew about the first betrayal. The first betrayal was through a Dutch agent, as I say, called Christian Lindemans, who was this sort of larger than life figure. He was cool. He worked for the British. As I said, he was called King Kong because he was so enormous and he had such awesome. He was a rower. He had awesome rowing strength, but he was also a bit of a psychopath. And he would shoot first and ask questions later. He was a dangerous, ruthless man to know, but he's the betrayer that everyone knows about. People have written books about him before. The Dutch are still obsessed with his role in Market Garden, his betrayal, and his closeness to Prince Bernhard, who was a member of the royal family, Dutch royal family, and the leader of the Dutch forces in Europe. So people know about him. This is the thing. So I was writing his story with my relative Eddie Verkaik, because they kind of knew each other, and Eddie was the one who betrayed him to the British in the end. But no one really knew about the second betrayal. As I say, on the 16th of September, the eve of Market Garden, 1944, the full battle plan was delivered to the Germans, and no one seems to investigate it. So if you look at the files, you'll see that there's a reluctance to investigate it. There's a willingness to dismiss it as something that was of no consequence. And it's only in the 1970s, don't know exactly when, but MI5 decided that they would investigate it for no reason. There was no obvious reason, apart from the fact that Anthony Blunt was about to be exposed as a spy. And it's at this point that MI5 decide to, 30 years after the war, decide to conduct an inquiry into Josephine and Market Garden. And although Anthony Blunt is mentioned in the inquiry, and the papers, there's something like 500 pages of documents, and he's in it all over. But at no point does the inquiry mention the fact that Anthony Blunt was a Russian agent. They treat him as if he was an ordinary military officer working for the British Security Service. He's not treated as someone who was working for the Russians against the British. That, I think, is extraordinary and kind of tells you everything you need to know about why the whole operation and the betrayal theory has never been properly explored, because it was extraordinarily embarrassing for the British, and particularly for their relationship with the Americans and the Dutch, because if they'd found out that Blunt had not only, there was not only a Cambridge spy ring, but there was also an agent who had delivered documents not just to the Russians, but ultimately to the Germans, and therefore cost the lives of not just thousands of British, but also American soldiers and thousands of Dutch citizens who were starved to death in the aftermath of Arnhem. That is an extraordinary amount of blood on Blunt's hands.
Yeah, and I can see how the willful blindness of just, we don't see this because Blunt was one of us. He was, he had this storied career in intelligence, and nobody wants to be embarrassed by not seeing what was in plain sight for so long.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what happened, and they'd hoped it all went away, and it kind of did, really. But we had a release in Britain. National Archives in Kew released more material about the spies, and this is probably the biggest release of material about the Cambridge group ever. And this was only January, so a few weeks ago, January the 14th. And in that release, and some of this is going to be in my revised edition, which is going to be published in March, includes more agents who were working with Blunt and the Russians to betray Arnhem, including Guy Burgess, who was obviously another one of the Cambridge Five and very close to Blunt, and he was trying to get, because just before Arnhem, there were a lot of Dutch intelligence officers and pilots in Britain, and if you look at the MI5 files, you can see conversations that he was having with the Dutch soldiers, flyers, intelligence officers, where he's trying to find out what Operation Market Garden is all about. And we simply didn't know that. And it's only, although there were British officers who were suspicious, no one actually rumbled him. And the files also show there was another unknown Cambridge spy, perhaps a sixth man, who actually was working for the Russian military attaché in London, and he was probably more influential than Blunt in terms of the Arnhem intelligence. Although you can see how Blunt was instrumental in getting it to the right people, it was this sixth man who was working for a special forces unit who was sent in to Arnhem ahead of the rest of the forces, and it was he who I think, gave Blunt and the Russians the key intelligence. But you can read about him in the paperback edition, because these files just had enough time to sneak him into the book.
There's always new history to uncover, right?
Really is.
So, okay, there's web upon web upon web of loyalty here, and the Russians are our allies. We're both fighting the Germans. Why would the Soviets want Market Garden to fail? Why would they want to get this information passed to the Germans?
As I say, we're talking about the military and geopolitical picture in 1944. So Stalin is already looking towards the end of the war, and he's looking at the spoils of war, and all he wants to do is get to Berlin and perhaps further. I mean, he had ambitions to go as far as he possibly could, and then drop the Iron Curtain. But Market Garden and the collapse of the German front in Normandy meant that it was only a very remote chance that the Red Army was going to get there before the British and Americans, and so it was vital that he made sure that Arnhem did not succeed. Because think about it, if Arnhem had succeeded, we would have been a couple of 100 miles from Berlin, while he and the rest of his Red Army were many more, probably double the distance. And we would have been in Berlin before the Russians. We might have even pushed the Iron Curtain further back to the borders of Ukraine. I mean, Stalin was, he was a strategist, and he understood much more than anybody else the bigger picture. Perhaps, and so did Churchill. And Market Garden was going to settle the terms of the end of the Second World War.
We were fighting the Soviets and didn't even realize it.
We didn't. We woke up to it very late. We woke up to it, just after the war. When, what is surprising is that during the war, British intelligence, they'd so trusted the Russians that we didn't have a single spy in Russia, whereas the Russians had dozens. We don't even know how many, but there was far more than the Cambridge Five, and they had penetrated the heart of British establishment, senior echelons of the military and the political classes. They knew everything, sometimes before Churchill did, especially with Blunt, because Blunt was the one who was in charge of writing reports on MI5, so monthly updates on what MI5 are up to, and handing them to Churchill. That was his job. Of course, he gave them to Stalin before. So Stalin knew what we were thinking before Churchill had even thought it.
Oh, I love it. Now, I'm really curious about this Lindemann character, because I forget my English, I've not heard of him before. So how does his story compare to the other double or triple agents of the war, like Kim Philby and Richard Sorge?
Yeah, Lindemann's is not temperamentally is not much of a Kim Philby. I mean, Philby was is a bit of an aesthete. He was a British aristocrat, really. And Sorge the same, German, well-to-do German. They were placed high up in the Japanese embassy in Tokyo was Serge, and obviously Philby was in London, part of MI6, the foreign secret agency. So, and they were established. They were professional spies, professional intelligence officers, if you like. Whereas Lindemann's was much rawer. He was, a brute of a man, really. As I said, he was a bit of a psychopath, and he shot first, asked questions later. he had lots of. He was a womanizer. He was a Rotterdam playboy, really, who happened to who started by working for the highest bidder, but gathered lots of war loot along the way, setting up escape lines, ferrying rich Dutch people down the lines back to Britain, and also feeding the British with intelligence before he switched sides, before he started working for the Germans. After his brother and his lover were arrested by the Germans, in March 1944, he went over to the head of the German intelligence and said, "Look, if you release my brother and girlfriend, I'll work for you." The Germans couldn't believe their luck, and this was March 1944. Very few people were switching sides in March
Right.
1944 when the war had already was basically was won. No one really doubted the outcome. Lindemans turned up and offered his services, and as a result, he betrayed something like 267 Dutch, French, Belgian, British agents. He had no qualms about that. He might have even betrayed his own girlfriend. There's evidence that he was the one who provided the intelligence that allowed the Gestapo to find her in the first place. So he was pretty ruthless. But it turns out, if you read the archives in Amsterdam, and in America, actually, there's the American archives, military archives, Maryland have got files on it. You can see that he was ultimately working for the Russians, and even when he was captured in 1940, late 1944, and then held in the Dutch by the Dutch in 1946, he still thinks the Russians are going to help him escape from prison. He still thinks they're going to bust him out, because his girlfriend ends up taking a job with the Russian embassy in the Hague, and you can see how his mind works. But to answer your question, how do you compare him to Philby Serge? He's a very different kind of agent. Although the secrets he delivered might have been just as helpful to the Russians as the ones that Philby Serge did.
One of the major figures in your book is Soviet spy master Ivan Chichev. How much influence did Stalin's intelligence operations have over the outcome of Mark?
Yeah, Ivan Chichev was the sort of the head of the spy station. Really, he was running a lot of the operations along with the military attaché and some subordinates. So it was an industry, really. The Russian spy network was a sophisticated industry, something that we really didn't understand and overlooked. And what they did in London, they did in all the other capitals of the world. In Stockholm, where the actual market garden intelligence ended up, was where Shayev had been head of station before he came to London. The Russian intelligence network, the NKVD, was reached just about every part of British society, and as I said, went right to the heart of the government machinery of government. And Chev was one of the ringmasters, although always answering to Moscow.
So now it's very clear that the Cambridge Five played a role in the downfall of Market Garden. Were they working purely for the Soviets, or did they have other motivations?
That's good. That's a very good question, because the Russians certainly at one point suspected them. They couldn't believe they were who they said they were. Think of it from Moscow's perspective. These are five well-connected British gentlemen who decided to change sides and start spying and betraying their country. In terms of the Russian, in terms of Russian thinking and the ideology and the communist Bolshevik ideology, they didn't fit the pattern. Most of the Russian spies tended to be members of the proletariat. They didn't understand why people like Kim Philby, Anthony Blunt would give up very good careers in British politics and government and throw their lot in with the Russians. They weren't convinced, and they were so unconvinced that they sent a team of Russian spies themselves to London during the war to follow the Cambridge Five around to make sure they weren't really working ultimately for the British. But they didn't really establish anything. So it wasn't. So for some time during the war, the Cambridge Five weren't really taken seriously. It was only when the intelligence started to pay off. So talking about D-Day, Blunt delivered the whole Operation Overlord plan to his Russian handlers. The Russians Stalin knew about D-Day when Churchill did, when Roosevelt did. We're talking about a very sophisticated spy network, and Chechev was just part of it. And the Cambridge Five were perhaps too good to be true to start off with, but became absolutely crucial to Stalin's war plans.
They couldn't believe their luck.
Really good.
It's also it's very cynical of the Soviets, because they're like, they never, this idea that these British aristocrats couldn't support the Soviets on principle alone. Like, there had to be some kind of nefarious intent there. It's typical Soviet thinking. So
Indeed.
So you referenced newly released archives in your book. What was the most critical piece of declassified intelligence or evidence that changed your understanding of the whole operation?
Well, there were lots of documents that I read that helped to sort of paint the picture of the betrayal. As I said, some of the documents were in Amsterdam, some of them were in The Hague, some of them were in Kew, some of them were in Washington. But I think that the document that kind of was a sort of light bulb moment was this document written by a British MI5 and MI6 officer. She'd worked in both agencies during the war, and her name was Pat McCullum, who's also the surname of the current Director General of MI5, but no relation, I'm sure. So she was the one who decided, or was asked to, let's face it, she must have been asked to draw up a report, an inquiry into how Agent Josephine had come into possession of the complete battle plan for Market Garden. And in the report that she wrote, she sets out exactly what Josephine had got his hands on, and it was in detail the description of all the units used in the battle. So this was the American 101st, Band of Brothers unit division, airborne division. It was the 82nd Airborne Division and the British 1st Airborne Division. So these were all identified, And not only that, but their targets during Operation Market Garden were also identified. So bridges of Eindhoven, around Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and on. These were all detailed in this leaked plan of the battle. But not only that, it said exactly when these airborne forces were to land in Holland and where the drop zones were. And this was, for me anyway, an extraordinary moment. And I couldn't quite understand why Pat McCullen didn't quite see it like that. She was very happy to describe it as, oh dear, this is just a mystery, isn't it? What could have possibly happened? How did the Germans get hold of it? Who was Josephine? MI6 were convinced that Josephine was a mole working from London. But if you read the report, you get the feeling that Josephine wasn't anybody at all, and that it's all extraordinary luck that Josephine had managed to leak what was the detailed battle plans. So for me, it was that report that, and because it just turned up without there was no introduction to it, it just turned up with there was no announcement, and it just turned up in the archives in 2003, I think it was. So very long time after after the war, after Arnhem, and quite a long time after she'd actually written it.
So I have a kind of a fun research question. Then it's like, how how do how do you authors and researchers find out about these documents as they're released, or like, do people camp out at the archives and wait for new documents to be released?
Well, in the old days, it was a very sort of painstaking um, investigation or piece of research, because it was all hard copy. So you were sometimes just you were looking for a needle in a haystack in terms of what you want. But since digitalization, it's completely transformed the whole research experience. It means that you can look for um, research papers or documents or secret minutes or whatever by using the search engines, and you will find things that will link to your area of interest, which you would have never have found maybe 20, 30 years ago. And that's the new experience. And the thing is, they're being digitalized so quickly that historians and historical researchers, can't get them quick enough. They can't, and you're kind of there's almost too much material these days, and it's kind of blinding you to um, to getting to the sort of kernel of what you're trying to uncover. But it's great. It's great. It's a wonderful time to be a researcher.
Well, one wonders what secrets are buried in plain sight in the deluge of information that comes out.
Well put. I think that's exactly what's happening.
There might be a strategy there.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
so there's some overlap with my next question, but much of your book takes place in the shadows of history. How difficult was it to piece together these events when so many intelligence files were deliberately obscured after the war?
I think you have to be a sort of you begin by being a policeman, don't you? So you capture as much evidence you possibly can. Then you sort of lay it out, and then you become a sort of lawyer. Really, you sort of take the evidence and you follow it, and you see and you argue, knowing the motives of the individuals and the governments involved. You then pursue it to its nth degree, and you try and mold it and see how it would fit into a political agenda or pattern. And then you end up ultimately being a judge. You have to decide on the weight of the evidence which way your judgment call will go. So with Market Garden, I followed the evidential trail. I didn't really know where it was going. I was writing about my relative who happened to be a member of the resistance in the Second World War in Holland. He'd been shot by the Germans when he thought the Germans were surrendering to him, but they shot him down in cold blood. It was a good story, but the evidential trail, and if you're curious, the evidential trail can take you absolutely anywhere. A load of rabbit holes you can dive into and wish you hadn't. But with this book, it was really a case of taking these evidential trails, establishing what was interesting, what was new, and then you have to come up with some sort of explanation. Once you've gathered all the evidence, and as I said, made the judgment call, then you have to establish a narrative and an explanation for how these files tell you what they're telling you, and try and find out why they're telling you what they're telling you, or what they're not. Sometimes what they're not telling you, what they're, as you say, sort of, why would you obscure this piece of information? What's the advantage? What's the motive for hiding a document or a minute that seems innocent enough?
Sounds like a fascinating puzzle.
It's a puzzle. It is a puzzle.
So Market Garden was famously depicted in the film A Bridge Too Far. Does your new research challenge any of the conventional wisdoms or myths about the operation?
I think it's a good film, actually. I mean, it does cover the major events, and it's like, and obviously in Hollywood style. I mean, and the film depicts the arrival of the German Second Panzer Division. These two panzer units who were used by the Germans to ultimately defeat the First Airborne Division and General Gavin's American 82nd Division, and and the surprise that the British and Americans experienced when they discovered that they landed on top of these two battle-hardened panzer divisions was well covered in the film, I thought. But what I guess what the film doesn't do is it doesn't talk about Lindemans. It talks about the intelligence problem, which was that some of the Dutch intelligence, intelligence from resistance was actually very good, and if they'd listened to it, they might have had second thoughts about Arnhem. But they don't. There's a reason for that, and I think partly the reason is that people like Lindemans, who ended up working for the Germans, and a whole other intelligence catastrophe that I'm sure we haven't got time to go into, but just before Operation Market Garden, all the British and Dutch agents who were sent into Holland were captured because of an intelligence cock up, really. So the film talks about the failure to recognize the significance of the intelligence. The reason that is because they don't really trust the Dutch, because they think they're infiltrated and already working for the Germans. But my book talks more about why there was an intelligence failure and these two betrayals, because the book doesn't mention the film doesn't mention either of the betrayals. The book mentions Lindemans, but not to any significant degree. But no one's touched on Anthony Blum.
Well, it's interesting that there's this huge set piece battle with thousands and thousands of men, and yet there's this whole other silent battle occurring where these soldiers are almost a pawn in a different game and they don't even realize it. and it's an even bigger game that Stalin is moving chess pieces.
Yeah, that's why he was so good at fighting the Cold War. I think he knew he was ruthless, and the Second World War was just a warm up for the very Cold War.
So, did you find any evidence that Churchill or any other Allied leaders suspected treachery but ignored it for political reasons?
No, I couldn't. I didn't find any. I didn't find anything that showed that Churchill knew about Blunt or knew about any Cambridge Five betrayal. I mean, in fact, it's extraordinary how, and this is the problem when you have an intelligence service that recruits from a certain class, an old boys network, if you like, and therefore, when one of them or several of them turn out to be double agents, it becomes impossible for them to recognize them because they're ones of their own, and they never suspect their own of being traitors. So it wasn't even when Burgess and MacDonald Maclean defected to Moscow in 1951, Philby and Blunt were still, although questions were raised about them, they were still at liberty. They were still working in some form or other for the intelligence services because the people investigating them were their old mates who they'd been working with during the war. And so I think that's why it was impossible for anyone, including Churchill. And Churchill relied on his intelligence advisors, so they never ever suspected, I think, that the intelligence problem went to the heart of the British establishment. In fact, Churchill was more worried about the French and de Gaulle and the communists among de Gaulle's entourage than he was about British spies.
So, we kind of touched on this earlier in our discussion, but so if Operation Martin Garden had succeeded, how do you think the timeline of World War II would have changed? And would we have beaten the Allies to Berlin? How would the Cold War have been different, or would it have happened at all?
Yeah. Well, I think you can begin by saying that that if we got to Berlin first, obviously, then the geopolitical landscape would have been changed. The whole geography of post-war Europe would have been very different, and the Russians would have been pushed further back. And there might have been an Iron Curtain, but it might have been much further east, and there might not have been such a huge Soviet empire. There may not have even been a Cold War. There may not have been Bay of Pigs, if you like, if you want to extrapolate. And it certainly wouldn't have been a sort of a Putin trying to emulate Stalin and invade his neighbor. I don't think the patriotic war would have been the Great Russian Patriotic War would have been framed in very different terms, and the politics of today would have been different. But I think if you go right back to Market Garden, and although the Americans were reluctant to get to Berlin before the Russians anyway, certainly Churchill wanted to push on. But even in 1945, after we crossed the Rhine and were heading supposedly for Berlin, Patton and Montgomery and Churchill came up with a plan to land using even more troops in Market Garden in an airborne capture of Berlin. It was going to be, a huge air landing on the German capital, and it would have put us right in the driving seat. And Patton, who was not a great fan of Montgomery's, and they were unlikely comrades in this operation. But it was going to happen. But Market Garden had kind of persuaded them that it was too risky. If it went wrong, even more British American soldiers would lose their lives. And and Roosevelt was very dubious about the idea of putting American soldiers in harm's way or exposing them to the Russian front line. He didn't want them to confront the Red Army because he thought he understood Stalin. He thought he'd come to an agreement. He didn't understand that the Cold War was already being fought, and the Russians already had plans for the occupation of Germany, Austria, the Balkans. He thought he could do a deal. So the capture of Berlin by an airborne invasion or an airborne operation never took place. And one of the reasons that was because of how disastrous Arnhem had proved.
Very interesting. So for my final question, if readers take one lesson from your book, what would you hope it would be?
I would hope that a reader of the book would discover that the intelligence war is just as fascinating as the battlefields. I think that the jeopardy and the scheming of the double agents and the spy masters and the influence this has over the military planners and the way that operations like Market Garden are undermined by traders is just as interesting a story as an operation like Normandy or the big staged battles of the Second World War. I think the intelligence wars are infinitely more fascinating.
Yeah, they're much smaller, but with bigger ramifications. They're much more personal stories than a big set piece battle. So it's you've converted me. I think I'm gonna have to buy more books about spies. My wallet's already quivering. So, well, thank you for joining us on the Anglotopia podcast, Robert. The book is called The Traitor of Arnhem, and it's now available from booksellers everywhere. We will put a link in the show notes. If you enjoyed the Anglotopia podcast, please don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, or hit the like button. See you next time. Thank you, Robert.